Your son already picked up your husband's truck this morning, right? The nurse asked as she adjusted the blanket over my legs. And for a moment, I thought the pain medication had confused my hearing again. I stared at her from the narrow hospital bed, my chest still aching from surgery, my hands cold despite the warm Texas afternoon sunlight pouring through the window. What truck? I asked quietly. The nurse paused, her smile fading just slightly. The old Ford pickup, she said. Your daughter-in-law mentioned it yesterday when she came by with the discharge paperwork. Something inside me tightened, so suddenly it felt worse than the stitches beneath my ribs. Thomas's truck. My late husband's 1978 Ford F-150. The truck he spent 15 years restoring with his own hands in our garage behind the house. The truck he refused to sell even when money was tight after the recession. The truck he once told our son Michael would stay in the family long after he was gone. I swallowed carefully. Nobody was supposed to touch that truck, I whispered. The nurse looked uncomfortable then, realizing she had stepped into something she didn't understand. Oh, she said softly. I'm sorry, Mrs. Harper. I just assumed. She didn't finish the sentence. She adjusted the clipboard at the foot of my bed and quietly left the room. I sat there listening to the steady beeping of the monitor beside me while dread slowly spread through my chest like cold water. Courtney had visited me the evening before wearing one of those expensive cream-colored sweaters she always seemed to buy even though she constantly complained about bills. She'd smiled sweetly while handing me sugar-free pudding and talking about how stressful the hospital stay had been for everyone. Not once had she mentioned Thomas's truck. Not once. I looked toward the window again. For months earlier, before the surgery, I had stood in our driveway running my fingers across the faded blue paint on the truck's hood while remembering Thomas wiping grease from his hands with an old shop towel. Even after cancer weakened him near the end, he still insisted on starting the engine once every Sunday morning just to hear it run. A truck like this deserves to stay alive, he used to say with that quiet grin of his. After he passed away 2 years ago, I kept the keys in the top drawer of my nightstand beside his watch and wedding ring. Some nights, when the house felt too quiet, I would open the drawer just to hear the soft jingle of the keychain he carried for 40 years. That truck was not just metal and tires. It was Thomas. It was our marriage. It was every camping trip, every Sunday hardware store run, every memory of Michael sitting between us on the old bench seat eating French fries after Little League games. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Courtney walked into the room carrying a large iced coffee and wearing oversized sunglasses pushed into her blonde hair. There's my favorite patient, she said brightly. She leaned down and kissed my cheek lightly, smelling of expensive perfume and vanilla lotion. Ready to finally get out of here? I watched her carefully. The nurse said someone picked up Thomas's truck. Courtney's smile froze for half a second before returning smoother than before. Oh, she said casually, setting the coffee on the side table. Yeah, about that. My fingers tightened around the hospital blanket. What do you mean, about that? She sighed the way people do when explaining something obvious to a child. Evelyn, come on. The truck was just sitting there collecting dust. Michael and I agreed it made more sense to sell it. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her words. Sell it, I repeated quietly. You sold Thomas's truck? It was practical, she said quickly. Honestly, it needed work, and you can't drive anymore after the surgery. Plus, the garage has been cluttered for years. I felt the room tilt slightly. Who gave you permission? Courtney crossed her arms gently, still keeping her voice soft enough to sound reasonable. Michael's your son. It's family property. Family property. The words hit me harder than the surgery itself. Thomas's name had still been on the title. I knew because I had seen the paperwork last winter while organizing the filing cabinet. Courtney looked away briefly before speaking again. You really shouldn't stress yourself right now. The doctor said recovery needs to stay calm. Calm. That word almost made me laugh. Instead, I looked down at my thin hospital hands resting on the blanket. At 71 years old, grief no longer arrived loudly. It arrived quietly, like an empty chair at dinner, like a cold side of the bed, like a missing truck in a driveway you've looked at every morning for 43 years. Courtney kept talking, filling the silence with explanations about storage space and finances and how things needed simplifying now. I barely heard her. All I could picture was the empty concrete space beside the garage where Thomas's Ford had always sat under the shade of the oak tree. Courtney finally checked her phone and smiled again. Michael's bringing the car around. We'll get you home soon. Home. The word no longer sounded comforting. As she walked out into the hallway, I noticed something strange for the first time. She never once told me who bought the truck. The drive home from the hospital felt longer than usual, even though our neighborhood sat less than 12 miles from St. Mary's Medical Center. Michael drove quietly with both hands tight on the steering wheel, while Courtney sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone as if nothing important had happened. I watched familiar streets pass by through the window while the soreness in my chest pulsed with every bump in the road. The doctor had warned me recovery would take weeks. No lifting, no stress, plenty of rest. I almost smiled thinking about how impossible that sounded now. Michael finally cleared his throat near a red light. Mom, we were going to tell you about the truck once you got home. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered from when he was younger. I turned slowly toward him. Then why did a nurse know before I did? Neither of them answered immediately. Courtney kept her eyes on her phone screen. We did what made sense, she said finally. You were in surgery. We did not want to burden you with unnecessary decisions. Burden. That word stayed with me the rest of the ride home. Thomas used to say people revealed themselves through the words they repeated. Most often, Courtney always talked about efficiency, practicality, minimizing burdens. She treated emotions the same way some people treated old receipts cluttering a kitchen drawer. Disposable. When we pulled into the driveway, my chest tightened before the car even stopped. The empty space beside the garage looked larger than I imagined. For 43 years that old Ford had sat under the oak tree, rain or shine, summer heat or winter frost. Now there was only bare concrete and a dark oil stain Thomas never quite managed to clean completely. I stared at the spot, so long Michael eventually turned off the engine and looked at me carefully. Mom, he asked softly. I opened the car door without answering. The late afternoon Texas heat wrapped around me immediately, carrying the smell of dry grass and distant barbecue smoke from a neighbor's backyard. Normally coming home comforted me. Thomas planted every rosebush lining the walkway himself. He painted the shutters 3 summers ago while wearing that ridiculous straw hat he loved. But that afternoon the house felt unfamiliar, as though something important had been removed from its foundation. Courtney hurried ahead and opened the front door. I washed the guest room sheets for you, she announced brightly. The stairs are probably too much right now, so we thought it would be easier if you stayed downstairs a while. We thought. Another decision already made without me. I stepped inside slowly. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and lavender candles Courtney liked to buy in bulk. Thomas hated scented candles. He used to joke they made the house smell like a shopping mall. My eyes drifted automatically toward the hallway table where his keys once rested in a ceramic bowl. The bowl was gone now. Where are Thomas's things? I asked quietly. Courtney froze near the kitchen doorway. What things? His keys. His watch stand. The photographs from the hallway. Michael looked uncomfortable immediately. Courtney reorganized a little while you were gone, he muttered. Reorganized. I walked farther into the living room and realized several framed pictures had disappeared too. The photograph of Thomas beside the Ford after finishing the engine rebuild was gone from the mantel. So was the black and white wedding picture we kept near the staircase. In their place sat beige candles and decorative books no one would ever read. Courtney noticed me staring. I just wanted the house to feel less cluttered, she explained carefully. A cleaner space helps with healing. I lowered myself slowly into Thomas's old recliner. The leather still creaked the same way it always had. Across the room, Michael stood awkwardly with his hands in his pockets while Courtney moved around the kitchen opening cabinets louder than necessary. For the first time since Thomas died, I suddenly understood how loneliness could exist even inside a full house. Who bought the truck? I asked finally. Courtney appeared in the doorway holding a glass of water. Some collector outside Austin. Name? She hesitated too long. I would have to check the paperwork. Paperwork. Another word that made my stomach tighten. Thomas kept every important document in a locked file cabinet in the garage workshop. He organized titles, receipts, insurance forms, and maintenance records with military precision even though he never served a day in the military. Last winter, he spent an entire Sunday labeling folders because he said paperwork protected people from confusion later. Suddenly, I remembered something small but strange from 3 months before my surgery. Courtney standing near the garage asking Michael whether old vehicle titles expired over time. At the time, I barely noticed the question. Now it echoed differently in my head. I looked toward the hallway leading to the garage door. I want to see Thomas's workshop. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Mom, maybe tomorrow. You need rest. Now, I said quietly. Something in my voice must have surprised him because he nodded without arguing. The garage smelled different the moment Michael opened the side door. Less motor oil. Less sawdust. Less Thomas. Several shelves looked emptier than before. The old red toolbox remained against the wall, but many loose parts and equipment pieces had disappeared. I walked slowly toward the metal filing cabinet near the workbench. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the top drawer. Folders sat neatly inside exactly where Thomas left them. Insurance, property taxes, utility bills. But the blue folder labeled Ford 1978 was gone. I stared at the empty space for several long seconds while a cold heaviness settled deep in my chest. Then I noticed something else. The lock on the filing cabinet had fresh scratches around it, as if someone had forced it open with the wrong key. I did not sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the empty space beside the garage and the scratches around the filing cabinet lock. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps downstairs and the soft creak of the kitchen cabinets opening and closing. Courtney always moved through the house like she owned it completely, confident and careless at the same time. Thomas used to notice that too. One evening about a year before he died, he stood at the kitchen sink drying dishes while Courtney laughed loudly in the living room during one of Michael's work dinners. Thomas leaned closer to me and quietly said, "That woman rearranges things that do not belong to her." At the time I told him he was being unfair. Lying awake in bed now, I wished I had listened more carefully. The next morning sunlight spilled through the guest room curtains long before I felt ready to get up. My chest still ached from surgery, and every movement reminded me that my body was healing slower than my thoughts. I sat carefully on the edge of the bed listening to the muffled sound of Courtney talking on the phone downstairs. Her voice carried upward through the vents in short, cheerful bursts. "Everything is handled," she said at one point. Then quieter. "No, she does not know the details." Silence followed. By the time I reached the kitchen, she had already ended the call. Michael sat at the table staring into a mug of coffee while Courtney sliced strawberries onto avocado toast, as if we were living inside a home decorating magazine instead of the middle of a family betrayal. "Good morning," she said brightly. "How are you feeling today?" I lowered myself slowly into a chair. I would feel better if someone told me where my husband's truck really went. Michael rubbed his forehead immediately. Courtney placed the knife down with controlled patience. "Evelyn, we already discussed this." "No," I replied quietly. "You explained it. That is different." The kitchen became very still after that. Outside the window, the oak branches moved gently in the warm morning breeze. Thomas built the breakfast table himself 20 years ago after seeing a similar one in a woodworking magazine. Suddenly, I noticed fresh scratches on the tabletop near Michael's side, probably from Courtney's oversized designer rings. Tiny marks. Permanent damage from careless hands. Michael finally looked at me. "Mom, the truck was becoming expensive to maintain. It ran perfectly 3 months ago. It needed space we did not have. It sat in the same driveway for 43 years. Courtney folded her arms. "Honestly, I do not understand why everyone is acting like this was some sacred object." Her words settled over the room like dust. I looked at her carefully then. Courtney had beautiful features in the way magazine advertisements preferred. Perfect hair, smooth skin, bright white smile. But her eyes always stayed restless, constantly measuring people, situations, opportunities. Even now she looked irritated rather than guilty. "Your father taught me how to drive in that truck," Michael said suddenly, almost to himself. Courtney glanced sharply at him, surprised by the comment. He stared down into his coffee afterward without saying another word. I finished half a piece of toast before quietly standing up. "I need some air." Courtney immediately stepped forward. "The heat is too much for you right now." "I survived Texas summers before you married my son," I replied. The backyard looked exactly the same as it had the week before my surgery. Thomas's wind chimes still hung beside the porch. The vegetable garden remained half-watered. A faded baseball rested near the fence where our grandson left it during his last visit. Normal things. Familiar things. But grief changes ordinary objects into evidence. I slowly made my way toward the detached garage again. Inside, The silence felt heavier than before. Thomas's old radio sat on the workbench beside a pair of reading glasses folded neatly over a newspaper from 2 months ago. I touched the edge of the workbench gently. Dust patterns told stories if you looked carefully enough. Several empty rectangular spaces showed where boxes once sat. A lower shelf had been recently cleared too. Someone had removed more than just paperwork. I opened drawers one by one despite the soreness in my chest. Missing tools. Missing receipts. Missing maintenance logs Thomas kept for decades. Courtney had not simply sold a truck. She had erased pieces of him. Then I noticed something tucked beneath an old shop rag near the back corner of the workbench. A yellow carbon copy receipt. I pulled it free slowly. The paper was creased, but readable. Towing service. 2 weeks earlier. Destination listed only as Benson Auto Storage outside Cedar Creek. My pulse quickened immediately because I recognized the name. Ray Benson, Thomas's oldest friend. The man who helped rebuild the Ford engine 15 years ago. I stared at the receipt while dozens of small memories suddenly connected themselves inside my mind. Courtney asking about titles. Missing documents. Forced locks. Quiet phone calls. Empty shelves. She had planned this long before my surgery. And for the first time since coming home from the hospital, the grief inside me shifted slightly into something colder and far more dangerous. Determination. I waited until after dinner to call Ray Benson. Courtney spent the evening moving through the kitchen pretending everything was normal while Michael watched television without really paying attention to it. Every few minutes he glanced toward me with the same guilty expression he used to wear as a boy after breaking something valuable and hoping nobody would notice. But this was not a broken lamp or a dented mailbox anymore. This was trust. This was memory. This was my husband's life being quietly dismantled piece by piece while I recovered in a hospital bed. Around 8:30, Courtney announced she was taking a bath and disappeared upstairs. Michael followed shortly afterward, mumbling something about an early meeting the next morning. The moment I heard their bedroom door close, I picked up the cordless phone beside the recliner and dialed the number printed faintly at the bottom of the towing receipt. The line rang twice before a familiar gravelly voice answered. Benson Auto Storage. For a second, emotion caught unexpectedly in my throat. Thomas and Ray spent nearly 40 years talking about engines, football, and bad politicians over black coffee in this exact voice. Ray, I said softly. It is Evelyn Harper. Silence filled the line briefly. Then his tone changed completely. Evelyn, Lord above, how are you feeling? Recovering slowly. Thomas would be fussing over you every minute if you were here. I closed my eyes at that because it was true. Thomas believed soup could solve nearly any medical problem. Ray, I said carefully. I found a towing receipt in the garage. Another silence followed, heavier this time. I figured you eventually would, he replied quietly. My fingers tightened around the phone. You know where the truck is? Yes. The word landed softly but firmly. Outside the living room window, the porch light cast long shadows across the empty driveway. Why did nobody call me? I asked. Ray exhaled slowly. Because your daughter-in-law told everybody you already approved the sale. A cold numbness spread through my chest. I never approved anything. I know that now. His voice hardened slightly. But Courtney came by 3 weeks ago with paperwork and your son standing beside her looking half asleep. She said you wanted to simplify things after surgery. I looked toward the staircase instinctively even though nobody was there. Did Michael sign anything? No. Courtney handled most of the talking. That did not surprise me at all. Where is the truck now? Ray hesitated. Still here. My heart stopped for one brief moment. What? The buyer has not picked it up yet. Wealthy collector from outside Austin paid a deposit, but transport got delayed. I pressed my hand against my chest carefully, trying to steady my breathing. Thomas's Ford had not disappeared forever yet. Ray, I whispered, did you see the title? That is exactly why I did not let the truck leave. I sat straighter immediately. What do you mean? The signature looked wrong. His voice dropped lower. Thomas taught me enough about paperwork over the years to know something felt off. Your signature on the transfer papers looked shaky and inconsistent. Nothing like the Christmas cards you used to send Martha every year. I stared across the dark living room at the family photographs Courtney forgot to remove from the far bookshelf. Thomas holding a fish at Lake Travis. Michael at 16 beside the Ford after his first driving lesson. me smiling into sunlight that now felt like another woman's life entirely. "Ray," I asked quietly, "did Courtney ever speak to you alone?" He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Several times. Mostly about money. Of course she did. She kept saying the truck was wasted sitting in your driveway. Said sentimentality was expensive." I almost smiled hearing that, because those sounded exactly like Courtney's words. She always spoke about emotions as if they were unpaid bills cluttering the kitchen counter. "How much?" I asked finally. $28,000 cash offer." I closed my eyes. $28,000. Not enough to replace what the truck meant, but enough for someone desperate to ignore morality. Ray continued more gently. "Evelyn, I need to ask you something difficult." "Go ahead. Have you checked your accounts lately?" A strange chill moved through me. "No." "What?" "Because Courtney came into my office asking whether titles could be transferred from joint estate accounts without probate delays. That kind of question usually comes from people trying to move assets quickly." I felt suddenly cold despite the warm house. Thomas always handled finances carefully. Every account organized. Every signature documented. Every emergency planned years ahead. He once told me, "Paper trails matter because character disappears when money enters the room." At the time I laughed at him for sounding dramatic. Now I understood exactly what he meant. "Ray," I said slowly, "I think she planned this before my surgery. I think you are right." His answer came too quickly to ignore. Upstairs, I heard faint footsteps moving across the hallway. Floorboards. Courtney. Probably checking whether I had gone to bed yet. Ray lowered his voice even further. "Do not confront her yet." I was not planning to. Good. Because people who move this quietly usually hide more than one thing. After we hung up, I remained sitting alone in the dark living room listening to the grandfather clock Thomas inherited from his father tick steadily against the silence. Every second felt different now. Sharper. Clearer. I looked once more toward the empty driveway outside the window and realized something important for the first time. Courtney did not believe I would fight back. She thought age, grief, and surgery had turned me fragile. She thought silence meant weakness, and that was beginning to look like the biggest mistake she had ever made. The next morning I woke before sunrise to the sound of rain tapping softly against the guest room window. Texas storms always arrived suddenly in late spring, heavy clouds rolling in overnight like unspoken trouble. For a few moments I lay still beneath the blanket listening to the distant thunder and trying to remember what peace used to feel like inside this house. Then I remembered the empty driveway again. I remembered the missing paperwork. I remembered Courtney's voice saying sentimentality was expensive. Sleep no longer mattered after that. By 7 o'clock the smell of coffee drifted downstairs through the hallway. I moved slowly into the kitchen where Michael already sat at the table in wrinkled work clothes staring blankly at his laptop screen. Courtney stood near the stove making eggs while humming softly to herself. She looked perfectly comfortable, perfectly rested. People sleep well when they believe they control the story. "Morning, Mom," Michael said quietly. I poured myself coffee and sat down carefully across from him. "You heading to the office?" "Only for half a day." He hesitated before adding, "Courtney has some errands later." Errands. Another harmless word hiding something sharp underneath. Courtney carried plates to the table with forced cheerfulness. "I was thinking maybe we could all have dinner together tonight," she said. "A fresh start might be good for everyone." I looked at her over the rim of my coffee mug. Fresh starts usually happen after honesty. Her smile tightened almost invisibly. Michael quickly changed the subject to weather and road construction, but the silence underneath our conversation remained heavy and unfinished. After breakfast, Courtney left the house wearing oversized sunglasses despite the rain outside. I watched through the front window as she loaded several shopping bags into the back of her SUV before driving away. Shopping bags. At 9 in the morning. During a week, she claimed finances were stressful enough to justify selling my husband's truck. Michael left shortly afterward, kissing my forehead awkwardly before heading to work downtown. The moment his car disappeared around the corner, I walked directly to the hallway closet where Thomas kept the old lockbox containing household records. Courtney had apparently forgotten about it because it sat untouched beneath extra blankets and board games no one played anymore. Inside were old insurance policies, tax returns, and bank statements stretching back nearly 20 years. Thomas believed paperwork told the truth even when people did not. I spent nearly 2 hours sitting at the dining room table carefully sorting through documents while rain streaked softly down the windows. Eventually, patterns began appearing. Large withdrawals from one joint account over the past 6 months. Luxury department store charges. Resort reservations. High-end furniture payments I did not recognize. Courtney had not just been spending carelessly. She had been draining money quietly while distracting everyone with explanations about budgeting and practical decisions. Then I found something else. A credit card statement addressed only to Courtney Harper with an outstanding balance of nearly $19,000. My hands went still on the paper. Jewelry stores, designer boutiques, spa resorts outside Dallas. Thomas used to joke that rich people stayed rich by fearing debt more than embarrassment. Courtney clearly feared embarrassment far more than debt. I continued searching until another envelope caught my attention. It contained hospital billing. Information from my surgery. At first, nothing looked unusual. Then I noticed the payment account listed at the bottom of the page. One of Thomas's emergency savings accounts. An account only Michael and I were supposed to access after his death. Courtney had used my own late husband's savings to pay for procedures insurance already partially covered. The realization settled coldly into my stomach. She had not only taken from Thomas after death, she had used my illness as cover while doing it. Around noon, my phone rang suddenly, startling me hard enough to make my chest ache. Ray Benson. You all right? He asked immediately after hearing my voice. I have been better. I talked to the collector this morning. I sat straighter. And truck is still here. Buyer wants proof of title authenticity before final payment. Relief moved through me so fast it almost hurt. Thank God. But there is more. His tone changed carefully. Evelyn, somebody already tried accessing the garage ownership records too. I frowned. What garage? Thomas's repair property outside Bastrop. My breath caught completely. Thomas owned a small commercial garage lot he rented decades ago before retiring. Hardly anyone remembered it anymore, because the place stayed mostly inactive after his cancer diagnosis. How would Courtney know about that? I whispered. That is exactly the question bothering me. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while dread slowly spread through the room again. Thomas once told me that greed rarely stopped after one success. It kept moving, quietly, patiently, looking for the next unlocked door. Suddenly, the missing photographs, missing paperwork, and missing truck no longer felt like isolated incidents. They felt like the beginning of something larger. I thanked Ray and hung up slowly before walking into the living room. Across from Thomas's recliner sat the family portrait Courtney insisted on taking last Thanksgiving. Everyone smiling. Everyone dressed warmly around the fireplace, while hidden resentments moved quietly underneath the surface like cracks beneath frozen water. I stared at the photograph for a long time before finally understanding. Something painful. Courtney had never truly viewed me as family. I was an obstacle standing between her and what she believed should belong to her. That evening, I waited until the house became quiet again. Michael and Courtney went out together, saying something about dinner with a colleague, though Michael's voice carried hesitation that made me doubt even that simple explanation. The moment their car left the driveway, I locked the front door and returned to the dining room table where Thomas's old documents were still spread out like pieces of a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air remained heavy and still, as if the storm had only moved inside the walls of the house instead of leaving it. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down, pulling the stack of financial statements closer. Every page I turned felt heavier than the last, not because of the numbers themselves, but because of what they represented. Trust broken quietly. Decisions made without me. A life I thought I understood slowly rewritten in my absence. Around 8 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was not Ray Benson. It was an unknown number from the Austin area. I hesitated before answering. Mrs. Harper? A man's voice asked. Yes. This is Daniel Mercer. I am the attorney handling the pending sale of your husband's vehicle. My grip tightened around the phone immediately. Pending sale? I repeated. That truck is not for sale. There was a brief pause on the other end. I understand this may be unexpected, but I was provided signed authorization and supporting documents by Mrs. Courtney Harper and your son, Mr. Michael Harper. My pulse slowed for a moment, not from calmness, but from disbelief. You are saying you accepted documents without verifying them with me? I asked carefully. The signatures appeared valid, he replied, and the vehicle title transfer matched the identification on file. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling a dull pressure behind my ribs. Thomas always said paper could be forged, but intention could not. Where did Courtney give you these documents? I asked. She delivered them in person to our office 2 weeks ago, he said. Mr. Harper was present as well. 2 weeks ago. That timeline aligned perfectly with my hospital stay. The period when I was under medication, recovering, and unable to question anything happening outside those walls. Is the truck still in your possession? I asked. No, he replied. It is currently at Benson Auto Storage, pending final inspection before transfer to the buyer. My breath slowed slightly. At least Ray had kept it from disappearing completely. After ending the call, I sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the reflection of the kitchen light on the window glass. For a moment, I saw my own face faintly layered over the darkness outside. Tired, older, but not broken. Something inside me had begun shifting since finding the financial records. It was no longer confusion or grief. It was recognition. Courtney had not acted suddenly. Every step had been planned carefully around my absence, my illness, and Michael's distraction. I stood up slowly and walked to Thomas's old study at the far end of the hallway. The room had not been touched much since his passing. Books still lined the shelves exactly as he left them. Engineering manuals, property records, old notebooks filled with his handwriting. I opened the bottom desk drawer where he kept private correspondence. Inside, beneath several faded envelopes, I found something I had not seen in years. A copy of an old trust amendment Thomas drafted shortly after Michael's marriage. I unfolded it carefully under the desk lamp. The language was clear and precise. Any transfer or sale of family property connected to Thomas Harper's estate required direct consent from Evelyn Harper, regardless of medical condition or temporary incapacity, unless formally overridden in court. I read the sentence twice before fully understanding its weight. Courtney's paperwork had not only been dishonest, it had no legal foundation if this document still stood. I leaned back slowly in the chair as realization settled deeper. Thomas had anticipated more than I ever gave him credit for. He had not just built machines and maintained vehicles. He had quietly built protection around me long before I ever needed it. Upstairs, I heard the front door open and close. Michael and Courtney had returned earlier than expected. Their voices carried softly through the hallway, casual and unaware. I closed the folder gently and placed it back into the drawer. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I felt something other than uncertainty. It was not anger yet. Not fully. It was clarity. And clarity, I was beginning to understand, was far more powerful than shock. I did not sleep much after Michael and Courtney came home. Their voices moved through the house downstairs for a while, light and careless, discussing ordinary things like traffic, a restaurant they had passed, and something about a delayed meeting that Michael seemed too tired to question. I stayed in Thomas's study with the door slightly closed, listening to the rhythm of their lives continuing as if nothing beneath the surface had changed. But everything had changed. The trust was gone now. Only structure remained. And structure, I was beginning to understand, could be examined piece by piece. Early the next morning, I left the house before either of them woke. The air outside was cool, with a pale sunrise stretching across the Texas sky like a thin promise of calm. I drove myself slowly, even though the doctor had warned me not to push my body too soon after surgery. I did not feel weak that morning. I felt precise. Ray Benson's garage sat on the edge of Bastrop, just as he had described, a long gravel lot surrounded by aging oak trees and corrugated metal buildings. When I stepped out of the car, the smell of oil and dust and old machinery hit me immediately, familiar in a way that brought Thomas back into my mind so sharply it almost hurt. Ray was waiting near the open garage door, leaning against a workbench with his arms crossed. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were the same steady ones that had helped Thomas rebuild half the engines in our county over the years. "You should not be driving," he said first thing. "I am fine," I replied. He studied me for a moment before nodding toward the back of the property. "It is still there." My breath caught slightly, but I did not respond. We walked together past rows of parked vehicles, most of them half restored or waiting for parts. Then I saw it. Thomas's Ford stood under a tarp near the far end of the lot, untouched in a way that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. Ray pulled the tarp back carefully, revealing the faded blue paint beneath. The truck looked exactly as I remembered it, down to the small dent on the passenger side door from when Michael learned to reverse too quickly at 16 years old. I reached out and placed my hand on the hood. It was warm from the morning sun. "She has been here the whole time," Ray said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Not because I was surprised, but because I suddenly realized how close I had come to losing more than just a vehicle. I had come close to losing the last physical piece of Thomas that still existed in motion. "Courtney said she sold it," I finally said. Ray gave a short, humorless exhale. "Courtney says a lot of things." We stood in silence for a while. Then he walked over to a small metal table nearby and placed a thick folder down. "There is something else you should see." I opened it slowly. Inside were copies of emails, messages, and transaction attempts related to the truck. Most of them involved Courtney. Some involved Michael. A few involved financial institutions I did not recognize at first glance. But one detail stood out immediately. Courtney had attempted to reassign ownership of Thomas's garage property twice before the truck sale ever occurred. Both attempts had been flagged and rejected due to signature inconsistencies. "She is not just selling things," I said quietly. Ray shook his head. "No, she is testing what she can get away with." That sentence settled heavily in my mind. Not greed in isolation. Pattern. Strategy. Progression. I closed the folder slowly. "Did she ever try to contact you directly about me?" I asked. Ray hesitated. "Once." I looked up at him. "What did she say?" He rubbed the back of his neck as if choosing the right words. "She asked if you were mentally sharp enough to manage estate decisions after surgery." The words landed differently than I expected. Not anger first. Recognition. Courtney had not been waiting for opportunity. She had been building justification. I turned back toward the truck and placed my hand again on the hood. Thomas always said engines remembered how they were treated. I wondered if objects carried memory the same way people did. "Evelyn," Ray said carefully, "you are not dealing with confusion here. You are dealing with planning." I nodded slowly. That part one already understood. When I returned home later that afternoon, I found Michael alone in the kitchen. Courtney's car was gone. He looked exhausted, sitting at the table with his elbows resting on his knees, staring at nothing in particular. "Where is Courtney?" I asked. He did not look up immediately. "She went to meet someone about refinancing options." "Refinancing what?" He hesitated before answering. "The house." My chest tightened slightly, but I kept my voice steady. "This house does not need refinancing." Michael finally looked at me. There was something unfamiliar in his expression. Not defensiveness. Not certainty. Uncertainty. "Mom," he said quietly. "Courtney said we might need liquidity soon if medical bills increase." I sat down slowly across from him. "Did she show you any numbers?" He shook his head. That was enough. I reached into my pocket and placed a folded copy of Thomas's trust amendment on the table between us. "Your father made sure we were protected," I said. Michael stared at the document without touching it. "What is this?" "It means no one has the authority to sell anything connected to your father's estate without my consent." His face changed slightly as he read the first lines. Confusion first, then something closer to realization. "Courtney said everything was already handled legally," he said. I looked at him carefully. "Then ask her to show you the paperwork." Silence filled the room for several long seconds. Outside, a car door slammed. Courtney had returned early. I did not move immediately. Neither did Michael. We both listened as her footsteps approached the front door. In that moment, I realized something important. Truth did not need urgency. It only needed time to become visible. I was still sitting at the kitchen table with Michael when Courtney walked in. The front door closed softly behind her, followed by the faint sound of keys being dropped into the ceramic bowl she had recently replaced without asking. Her timing was precise, almost rehearsed, as if she had chosen the exact moment when conversation inside the house would be at its most fragile. She paused when she saw us both sitting there in silence, the folded document still resting on the table between Michael and me. For a brief second, something flickered across her face. Not fear exactly, more like calculation adjusting itself to a new variable. Then she smiled. It was the same smile she used when greeting neighbors or speaking to doctors. Warm enough to appear harmless, but controlled enough to stay distant. "I did not expect both of you to be home," she said casually, setting her purse down on the counter. Michael did not respond immediately. I watched his hands tighten slightly on the edge of the table. "We were talking," he said finally. Courtney nodded, as if that explained nothing important. "About what?" I leaned back slowly in my chair. "About your financial decisions," I said calmly. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the document on the table. She walked closer and picked it up without asking permission, scanning the first page. Her expression did not change much while she read, but I noticed the subtle tightening around her jaw. "This is outdated," she said after a moment. "We already handled estate updates through legal counsel last year." Michael looked at her immediately. "What legal counsel?" Courtney turned toward him smoothly. "The attorney your mother prefers not to use because of emotional bias." I almost smiled at that. Emotional bias. As if grief made documents less real. "You mean my husband's trust amendment?" I asked. She sighed softly, placing the papers back on the table. "Evelyn, I understand this must be overwhelming after your surgery, but there are practical realities we need to consider." The word "we" again. Always we. Never I. Michael finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "Courtney, did you sell the truck without telling Mom?" A brief silence followed. I watched her carefully. This was the first time I saw something other than controlled confidence in her expression. Not panic. Not guilt. Something closer to annoyance at being interrupted. "I handled it responsibly," she said. "The vehicle was underutilized and required maintenance costs that were not justified." "That is not what I asked," Michael replied. His voice was firmer now. Courtney exhaled slowly and turned toward him fully. "Michael, your mother was in the hospital. Decisions had to be made." I noticed how she framed it. Not "I made decisions." Decisions had to be made, as if responsibility belonged to circumstances rather than choice. I stood up slowly from the chair, feeling the faint pull of stitches beneath my chest. "Where is the money?" I asked. The question hung in the room differently than the others. Courtney looked at me directly for the first time since entering. "It was allocated toward household stabilization," she said carefully, "including medical costs and pending bills." I nodded once. "Show me." For the first time, her smile did not return immediately. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone instead, tapping the screen a few times before turning it toward us. On it was a spreadsheet. Numbers. Transfers. Expenses labeled in neat categories that did not match anything I recognized. Michael leaned closer. "What is this?" he asked. Courtney scrolled with her thumb. "Proof of fund distribution." I studied the screen without touching it. Thomas always said numbers could be arranged to tell any story if the person arranging them was confident enough. "That is not the sale price," I said quietly. Courtney's eyes met mine again. "It reflects net proceeds after necessary adjustments." I stepped closer to the table. "Necessary for who?" Another pause. This time longer. Then she said, "For the household." Michael turned fully toward her now. "Courtney, you told me the truck was gone because Mom agreed." Her expression softened slightly as she reached out to touch his arm. "I was protecting you from unnecessary stress." He pulled back gently but firmly. That small movement changed the air in the room. I could see it. Courtney saw it too. I picked up the trust amendment again and placed it next to her phone. "Thomas did not believe in unnecessary explanations," I said. "He believed in written authority." Her eyes dropped to the document again. This time she did not pick it up. Instead, she asked quietly, "What are you trying to imply?" I met her gaze steadily. "I am not implying anything. I am telling you that nothing you did regarding his property was authorized." The silence that followed felt different than before. Heavier. Michael looked between both of us, his confusion slowly turning into something more uncomfortable. "Courtney," he said slowly, "did you have legal permission for any of this?" She hesitated just long enough for the answer to appear on its own. Then she straightened slightly. "Everything was handled in good faith." Good faith. Another phrase without substance. I reached for my coffee cup, though it had gone cold. "Good faith does not transfer ownership," I said quietly. Courtney's composure tightened again. For the first time, I saw something sharper behind her calm exterior. Not fear. Resistance. The awareness that control was no longer absolute. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. Courtney had not expected resistance from me, but she was beginning to realize that silence was not the same as surrender. I woke early the next morning with a strange stillness in the house, the kind that feels heavier after conflict rather than calmer. The air in the hallway carried no sound of movement, no footsteps from upstairs, no running water, no quiet signs of normal routine. For a brief moment, I wondered if Courtney and Michael were still asleep. But when I walked into the kitchen, I found only Michael sitting alone at the table with his hands clasped together, staring at the folded trust amendment I had left there the night before. He did not look up immediately when I entered. When he finally did, his face looked different from the day before. Not confused anymore. Not defensive. Something closer to exhaustion mixed with realization. "She left early this morning," he said quietly before I could speak. I did not ask where. I already knew the answer. People do not leave early when they are confident. They leave early when they are uncertain about what they will face if they stay. I poured myself a glass of water and sat across from him. The house felt quieter than usual, but not empty. More like something had been removed that had been quietly controlling the shape of everything around it. Michael pushed the document slightly toward me. "I called the attorney listed here," he said. "He confirmed everything you said." I nodded slowly. "Then you understand now." He did not respond immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the table. "She said she was protecting us," he finally said. I set the glass down carefully. "Protection does not require deception." That sentence stayed between us for a long moment. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street, tires moving across wet pavement from last night's rain. Michael exhaled. "She sold the truck," he said, more to himself than to me. "And she used Dad's account." I did not correct him. I let him reach the conclusion on his own. That was always the hardest part for people like Michael. Not discovering the truth, but accepting the shape of it. Around mid-morning, my phone rang. It was Ray Benson again. His voice carried a different tone this time. More certain. "Evelyn, I think you need to come to the garage today." I already knew why. "Is it the truck?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "And something else." Michael looked up immediately when he heard me mention the garage. I stood slowly. "We are coming," I said. The drive felt different than before. The same roads, the same intersections, but everything looked slightly out of place, as if I was no longer inside the version of my life I had known for 40 years. Michael drove this time. He did not speak much, but his hands were steady on the wheel. When we arrived at Ray Benson's property, the truck was still there, parked exactly where I had seen it before, but now the tarp had been removed completely. Thomas's Ford sat in full daylight, unchanged, waiting as if it had never been part of any argument at all. Ray stood beside it with a folder in his hand. "I made copies of everything," he said as we approached. Michael stepped closer to the truck slowly, almost like he was afraid. It would disappear if he touched it too quickly. "Courtney told me it was already gone," he said. Ray shook his head. "It was never legally gone." He handed me the folder. Inside were corrected documents, notarized inconsistencies flagged, and confirmation emails from the collector who had withdrawn the purchase once legal irregularities were discovered. I turned a few pages, then stopped at one final document. A formal notice of invalid transfer due to unauthorized signature execution. My name was listed clearly as the only valid authority required. I closed the folder slowly. Behind me, Michael let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for days. "She lied about everything," he said quietly. I did not answer immediately because the word everything was too large for one moment. Instead, I walked over to the truck and placed my hand on the hood again. The metal was warm under the morning sun, familiar in a way that felt grounding rather than painful now. "No," I said finally. "She did not lie about everything." Michael looked at me. "What do you mean?" I turned toward him slowly. "She told the truth about one thing without realizing it." He waited. "She believed I would not notice," I said. "She believed I would not act." Ray closed the folder and stepped back slightly. "So what happens now?" he asked. I looked at the truck, then at my son. For a long moment I said nothing. Not because I was uncertain, but because clarity does not always require urgency. It only requires direction. "Now," I said quietly, "we correct every signature she ever thought she could replace." Michael looked at me for a long moment before nodding slowly, as if something inside him had finally aligned with what he already knew but had been afraid to accept. The morning air felt different as we stood there beside Thomas's truck. Not lighter, not heavier, just honest.